So I'm standing here today at Fort Ontario State Park near Oswego, New York, and the fort and the park today represents a couple hundred years of fortification of this eastern terminus of Lake Ontario, which you see behind me. Of course, from here, sailing all the way across Lake Ontario, you would eventually hit Canada. This spot was another one of those locations during the 18th century where the French, the British, and the local native populations vied for control of this corner of North America, known as the frontier by Europeans, and of course the home to Native Americans for many, many centuries. As early as the 1720s, there was a small trading post here established by the French, who would be moving down Lake Ontario from the St. Lawrence River over here to the east, and such other trading posts such as La Presentacion, which is near present-day Ogdensburg, New York, and of course further up the St. Lawrence into places like Montreal and Quebec. The original French trading outpost was back here on the western side of the Oswego River, where you see all of this modern industrial development. But this river right here where this development is divides a western bank from the eastern bank that I'm standing on. In the 1720s, the British arrive here, take over the abandoned previous the French trade outpost, establish a small fort to sort of control this northern terminus of what becomes part of the Oneida Carry. So from here, you can go down the Oswego River, all the way eventually to Fort Bull, Fort Stanwix, onward through the Mohawk River down to Albany, and from Albany all the way down to the Hudson River, and from the Hudson River all the way down to New York City, and of course the Atlantic Ocean. So this was the northern terminus of this sort of 18th century superhighway, which was so critical to the French and British control of this part of North America. Because once you were here on the on Lake Ontario, you could move down Lake Ontario all the way to the Niagara River, and from the Niagara River south into the center of the country, past Pennsylvania, and all the way into like the Mississippi River Valley, and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So this was just one of those loops on that very important transportation path that had been used, of course, by Native Americans for many centuries, but that were then capitalized on by Europeans. In 1756, a group of 1,000 French soldiers and Native American allies moved down from Ogdensburg, New York at Fort La Presentacion, land here, quickly overrun the small British garrison that's left here, and recapture this point for the French. In the spring of 1759, a British commander sets off in the campaigning season, and remember 18th century campaign seasons were kicked off generally in the spring and then concluded by the winter when they needed to be in a wintering quarters. That group steps off from Long Island in February of 1759. They make it all the way up to the Mohawk River and onward to here throughout those next couple of months. So by July of 1759, they arrive here, lay siege to the French force here, are surprised by another group of French soldiers sent to relieve them, and through that battle the British finally retake this spot, rebuild the fort, and use this as a jumping off point for the remainder of 1759 to their campaign all the way along Lake Ontario to the French-controlled Fort Niagara at the western end of Lake Ontario. Eventually, in July of 1759, after that siege takes place at Fort Ontario, the British capture that and thus seize this whole superhighway for the remainder of the French and Indian War. This becomes a key element in their victory, effectively cutting off the French from the interior of the country and stymieing them along this whole transport route along the lake as well as into the interior. So it's another one of these like super critical geographic locations that was vied and back and forth over decades in the 18th century. Following that, in the American Civil War, I mean the American Revolution, this place is abandoned. It does play a little bit of a part in the War of 1812, and then in the 1860s, following the close of the Civil War, this fort is rebuilt by the American government and garrisoned here in a more modern stone and brick built star-shaped fort. So the fort that you visit today has no remnants of this 18th century fort from the French and Indian War, but what it does do is it captures the importance of this point that it held over 150 years when France and England was vying for control of the North American continent.